Now that we've created the environment, let's go ahead and build a character to animate through it. So this is the version of the character that I came up with for this, and for the purposes of this class, you can feel free to just use my creature model that I've made directly without building your own. It's totally fine if you don't have the time to build this creature, but if you want to, feel free to take whatever artistic liberties you want with this. Feel free to use some external models. Whatever you want to do with this creature is totally fine. And I'll walk you through some of these procedural modeling steps involved with this. And, of course, this is an effects class, but these kinds of procedural modeling techniques are very useful for, various types of effects. I've done lots of things like, creating cuts and wounds on characters and healing those wounds, and like bubbles sliding across deforming surfaces. And lots of interesting things like this involve lots of procedural modeling tricks. So, hopefully this will give you some ideas about how you can approach modeling things in a kind of procedural way. And yeah, a lot of these little techniques could be useful for various things. So to get started here, I've already dropped in a few basic shapes to get going. So we have a sphere for the main body here. And I'm just going to chop off the front of it with this box here, just to flatten that off. So we can just do a little Boolean. I'll do a Boolean subtract, and sphere in the first input, box in the second. And that will, just with default settings, chop off that front edge. And I say default settings, but of course that's only if you've used this Boolean subtract, option here. If you just use a regular Boolean, of course that's not default, and you have to make sure to set the operation to subtract. But everything else is default. And then we can cut out an area inside this flattened region here to kind of create a bit of a indentation in there. So I've already created this tube roughly in that space there. And once again, we're going to do another Boolean subtract. Previous results in the first input, this tube in the second, and that cuts this area out nicely. And this is okay, but I actually want to have more resolution in this, this cutout area here. You can see that this is really just one big polygon. And in order to, create some more resolution through here, you could add that resolution afterwards, but in this case, I'm going to just do a bevel on the tube so that we have some more detail there. So we can just go to our primitive selection and pick this primitive at the bottom of the tube there, tab in the viewport, type bevel, and hit enter for that poly bevel tool. And then we can start increasing the number of divisions here and increase the distance to see how far this bevel will, go from the edge of that polygon. And in this case, I want it to go pretty far. Like I want this to go pretty much all the way into the center of this big, flat polygon there. So we'll use a much bigger distance. And this is totally rounding out that bevel shape and really destroying this. So we can change the shape from round to crease to kind of preserve that, original shape there. And then we can increase the divisions for some more resolution and a tighter match to the edges of this geometry here. So now if we display that Boolean subtract with the tube, you can see now we have a whole bunch of resolution in that region there. Alright, so now I'm going to kind of cut out these almost tooth-like shapes from the front of this edge here. And, I'm starting first with just this basic box to, cut out these little gaps there. And I want to duplicate this box to fan out in a full circle around the sphere here. And we can do that with a copy and transform. Then we can start increasing the number of copies here. And as we increase the number, there are multiple copies of this box being made, but they're not actually transforming yet. They're all just sitting on top of each other. So we can give each of these a rotation around the x-axis, like so, and those will fan out. And, I want these boxes to fan out in full, 360 degrees. And we can do this procedurally so that it calculates the right number of rotation degrees based on how many copies there are. So let's right-click the number of copies, copy parameter, paste that into the rotation angle, just paste relative references, and then we'll change that to be 360 divided by the number of copies. So this will automatically calculate the correct rotation amount to, fill that 360 degrees entirely. And then, we can change the number of boxes accordingly. In this case, I think 15 looks pretty good. And let's do another Boolean subtract. Previous results into the first input, boxes into the second. And then we get these kind of nice, like tooth-like shapes around the edge of this creature body here. Now, a couple things to watch out for when doing multiple Boolean operations. When you're chaining Boolean operations together, sometimes if you start getting errors at some point, you may need to turn off this detriangulate setting. This detriangulation does things to the mesh. It does this cleanup that makes for a nicer mesh, but it can actually cause some problems when doing subsequent Boolean operations. So in this case, these are pretty simple operations, so I'm leaving this alone. In the case of complex fractures, you may want to make sure to turn off detriangulation for every step until you do your final fracturing step. In this case, though, we're going to turn off detriangulation for another reason. Because right now we have some polygons that have lots of sides to them. Like the front of these teeth, for lack of a better thing to call them, are made up of lots of, sides on this polygon. There's at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, like 10 edges on this polygon. And you can get some weird things with normals and deformations when you have things that are not quads or triangles. So, because we're about to start applying some deformations next, I'm going to turn off the detriangulation at this step. We'll set that to no polygons, just to make sure that some of these deformations are a little bit nicer. Now I have the sphere already placed in here that I'm going to use to group these center points to kind of push this in to create this nice, like recessed region in this, I'm calling it the mouth area of the creature. So I'll just create a group, Boolean results into the first input of the group, and the sphere into the second. And we can turn off the base group because that just puts everything into this group that it's creating. Group name I'll call center front. And then we'll turn on keep and bounding regions, and we'll set this to bounding object. But you'll see this only works with points or vertices. So we can select that, but then we have to make sure to set the group type to points. And that's just grouping the region within the sphere here. So now I'll do a soft transform. Then we can push this back in X. But right now, this is pushing the entire creature. It's not really just pushing the area that we want. So in this group drop down, let's select the center front group. And right now this doesn't look very nice because this soft radius is pretty small. But if we increase this, you'll see we have a bit of a nicer fall off from the selected points to the surrounding areas. And then, something like that looks pretty nice. Kind of creates this nice rounded shape as that gets pulled in. And you can play around with the fall off shape on this with this soft type here. You could set that to quadratic for a slightly different shape there. You could do linear, but I think I'm going to leave this on cubic because I kind of like the shapes that this is creating. And then whenever I'm doing a bunch of modeling operations, I also like to just create some new normals at the end to make sure that, yeah, everything has some decent normals. Probably an optional step since there are already some normals on there and it doesn't really look any different, but sometimes it's safer just to keep that in there. And now we're building this creature in a whole bunch of different parts, and it's good to have the path attribute indicate what each section of the creature is. So I'm just going to use a wrangle. You could use an attribute create instead, and I'll just type, actually before I type anything, make sure this is set to run on primitives. I'll rename this to set path because that's what we're doing, and the vex is just s at path to create a string path attribute, and I'll set that equal to creature body main. And then we can move on to creating the eye region for this creature. Now to build the eyes, we'll start with this tapered tube shape to kind of create this like eye socket or a mount kind of shape. And I want to create a little ridge in here, so I will go to our primitive selection, select this primitive at the bottom of that tube, and we'll do a poly extrude on this. And for this first extrusion, I'm just going to do an inset, which will pull in that polygon and create this ring of polygons around it. And then with that still selected, I'll tab, do another poly extrude, enter on that. And for this, we'll just do a negative distance on this extrusion. And we don't have to set this in super far. I'm just creating a little recess so that we can put this half circle like eye lens in that area. So I'll just use another attribute wrangle to create a path attribute on this thing. I'm calling this eye mount. And then we can move over to this eye lens here. I'm just using a basic sphere for that. And for this one, I like using the polygon mesh type. You could use the regular polygon, but I think the wireframe layout of the polygon mesh works a little bit more nicely for this. And we don't need both sides of this. We're going to have a bunch of copies of this entire creature deforming along these animated paths. So I want to reduce polygons wherever I can. And even if it seems like it's not a huge polygon reduction, any bit of efficiency and effects work can be helpful. So I'm just going to do a clip on this and remove the backside of this eye sphere. So this clip stop will just cut off the geometry, and we can change the direction to go on the x-axis instead of the y. And I'll flip this to keep polys below the plane, and then we'll just transform this into place to match up with that eye mount tube. Let's template that, and then move this eye sphere into place. Cool. And we're going to do something kind of special with the eyes later. I'm going to use those as geometry lights and make them glow and illuminate the surroundings and everything. So I'm going to put an extra group on these. This is probably optional because you can use attributes for this most of the time. But because this is kind of a special case and we're doing more to the eyes later, I decided to, just create a group for those eyes. And then once again, we'll set a path attribute on those eyes with our primitive wrangle, calling that creature body eye. Then we can merge these together and position them on the actual creature. Now I want to modify this shape a little bit first. Instead of making this perfectly spherical, I kind of want to elongate this and stretch that out in Y a little bit. So in our transform SOP, I'll just stretch that out by 1.3. Let's template display this creature here. And then we'll position one just in the very center of this creature. So bring it forward a little bit, move it up into place, and that looks pretty good. And now I'm going to do something kind of like I did with the boxes and do a copy and transform to create a few more duplicates of these eyes rotating in both directions. So let's do that copy and transform once again. And in this case, I don't really want this to be a perfect 360 degrees, so we can do this a bit more by eye. I'll try doing 3 copies and just increasing the rotation here until we find something that looks nice. I think that looks pretty good. And let's make a duplicate of this. I'll right click on that copy and transform, and we can create a reference copy. And on this reference copy, all of these parameters are channel referenced to the original here. And we can modify this by going to the rotation, and we can change this reference expression here. So instead of just linking directly to the rotation amount from the other copy SOP, I'll go to that expression, say -1 times that rotation, and that'll make this go the other way. So we have these 2 copy SOPs that perfectly mirror each other, but we have this duplicate one in the middle, and you could just delete this manually, but I'll try to be a little bit more clever about it. We can go to the copy SOP and turn on this copy number attribute, and that will just number each copy accordingly, just 0, 1, 2, and it'll do it on our reference as well. So on either of these, we can just drop a blast SOP, and in the group we'll type copy num equals 0. So that'll just get rid of the first copy there so that we don't have the overlap with what the other copy and transform was doing. And then we can just merge these together. And we want to always keep things as efficient as possible, so it's good to always delete attributes that you're pretty confident you will never need again. And in this case, we won't need that copy num ever again, so let's just delete that attribute. And now we're all done with the eyes as well. Now this is starting to look pretty cool, but we can do some more modeling on this to make it more interesting. Like this back section here is looking a bit boring and perfectly circular, so let's do some additional modeling on there. And I'm just going to grab a single point and push it inwards to create a recess, and then I'll fatten up this whole region. So you could grab that single point manually, or if you want to do it procedurally, then you can use the group SOP, and we'll turn off the base group, turn on bounding regions, and this time we'll just use the bounding box option. I'll move that center point back, and it looks like we don't really need to change anything else. You could, change the size to make this a bit easier to grab points if you want. And right now this isn't actually grouping anything because it's not set to group points. So let's flip that to points and give this a better name. I'll call that end tip. And then let's create a soft transform. And I tab created that in the viewport. And this did create the soft transform for the correct point here, but it just used the point number. So to keep this all procedural, I will get rid of that point number and change this to end tip. And then we can, move that soft transform in to push that point inside the creature there. And as before, we'll use our soft radius to create a more nice rounded out shape there. Now let's create another group to grab a larger region that we're going to expand. So we'll drop in another group SOP, and we'll call this one end_expand. Once again, this will be points. Get rid of the base group, turn on bounding regions, move the center point to the back, and then we can start expanding this size to grab just the region that we want. And I'm just going to make this a bit larger than necessary, and we'll copy this Y component here, copy that parameter, and paste the relative reference into Z. So that's effectively grabbing this entire back region of this character here. Then we can create another soft transform, and I will once again get rid of that group, set this to the end expand group that we created. And I don't want to expand this a lot. We'll just go with a bit of a subtle expansion here. Even just like 0.1 in both Y and Z looks fine. It looks a little bit silly right now without much of a soft radius. So, we can just crank this up for a bit of a nicer fall off there. So turning that up to 10 kind of gives it this, like nice rounded blunt shape to that. And as I mentioned before, it's good to clean things up as you go so we can get rid of any groups that we don't need anymore. So just drop in a group delete, and we no longer need center front, end expand, or end tip. Now, one thing that can be really helpful when, look deving a character is to create extra geometry detail on here. Now, the more basic the surface is, the more work you have to do in texturing and shading to get it to look nice. You'll make your life a lot easier when trying to create something that looks interesting when you have extra geometry detail in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut in a whole bunch of ridges into this character to kind of give it this sort of biomechanical segmented look. And as always, there are multiple ways to do this sort of thing, but I'm just going to start by placing some grids evenly spaced throughout this body here. So I'll just create a grid, and we'll make this quite a bit bigger, do 30 by 30. Move this to the front of the character here, and we'll change the orientation to be on the YZ plane. And this will be the first ridge here, and we'll duplicate it backwards from there. And I want to be very careful about the placement so that these ridges don't go right through the eye lens. It might not be a problem to work around it, but yeah, I'm just going to try to avoid that. So once again, we can do another copy and transform to duplicate these grids. Let's try doing 30 copies, and we'll translate those in X. Let's template that and see what that looks like. It looks like that's avoiding the eye lens area nicely. Looks like a decent spacing for these grids here. Now let's find the intersections between these grids and the body. So let's create a Boolean stop, and this time I'm just using the standard Boolean because we're going to use some different options on this. We'll put the body into the first input, the grids into the second input, and on the operation, we're going to set this to seam so that we can just find those intersection points there. And we don't need the A to A seams or the B to B seams, essentially where A goes through itself or B goes through itself, so you can turn those off. And if you look at the Boolean output, now we're only getting these lines where the two different inputs intersect each other. And it might not look too nice to leave this partial intersection on this very last one here, so we can go back to our copy and transform and just turn down the number of grids that are being created. So when we turn this down to 25, then it's not including that last one that kind of only partially clips the edge of that body there. And now that we have these nice paths here, we're going to do a poly wire on these to create some, actual tube geometry along these lines. And if you're not happy with the resolution that you're getting, or if it's not spaced nicely, then you might want to resample this. Like we can try a length of 0.3. That doesn't really make a big difference, but this seems fine. And we'll do a poly wire. And we can give this a bit more resolution. Let's give this 6 divisions. Put it on smooth wire shaded. Zoom in a little bit. You can see when we give that 6 divisions, that rounds it out a little bit more. I don't want to go too crazy with this because I don't want to add tons of geometry resolution with these ridge things we're making. And you could potentially do these kind of ridges that are sticking out from the character like that. That's kind of an interesting like alternate thing, but for my version of this, I wanted to use these ridges to kind of cut out these like recessed parts in the character. And whenever you're doing booleans, it's going to mix attributes between the two objects that are being booleaned against each other. So, sometimes you might want to do some cleanup on this. Like, our original main body here doesn't have any UVs on it because we're not going to be doing any real UV texturing on this thing. So I'm just going to do an attribute delete on this poly wire here. And I'll delete the UV attribute so that we don't wind up adding random UVs to the main body. And before doing booleans, it's often good to have decent normals on your geometry. So I'll just add a normal sop. And once again, we'll add a path attribute for the body ridges. And finally, we're going to do another boolean subtract. Drop that down, and we're going to subtract this poly wire ridge geometry. And we already kind of made sure that we weren't intersecting the eyes, but just to make really sure that we're not going to be cutting out of those eye lenses, I'm going to do a split sop here. Let's split eyes, grab the eye group, and then the second output will be everything except the eyes. We'll put that into this boolean subtract and see what that looks like. And there we go. Now we have these interesting ridges cut away from the body, and that will help this to look quite nice without tons of extra UV texturing. Now we can merge this back together with the eyes, and then we'll add just a couple other interesting things. And when getting into these complicated procedural modeling things, I'll just keep this nice and organized. This is the body mod section. And I'm going to also create some kind of like welding detail between these eye mounts and where it meets the body. And when creating these sort of like seams between those areas of geometry, I don't necessarily need to have these welding seams go inside these divots. So I'm not going to base it on this, detailed body model. I'm just going to grab the original sphere, and we could drag a wire down, but sometimes I like just object merging in so that we keep our network a little bit cleaner. And I'll just point this to ... /sphere1, which gives us the original body shape there. And we can also do another merge for those eyes, which includes the eye mounts and the lenses. So object merge ... /eyes. And then we'll do another Boolean seams operation just like we did before. So drop in a Boolean, connect the two things, and this will be seam, turn off A to A and A to B. We only want the A to B seams, which gives us these nice outlines for where the body and the eye areas touch each other. Once again, you can resample this if necessary, and sometimes this resampling might affect the shapes that you're getting in the corners. So in this case, this resampling kind of rounds that out a little bit and spaces out the points a bit more evenly. If we're being very picky about this, you can see how without the resample, it's not quite as nice a shape there. With the resample, it's kind of evened out a little bit more. And we can do another poly wire for this. And this one we're not going to do a Boolean cutaway. We're just going to use the poly wire itself as this sort of welding seam. You can make this a little bit fatter, give it some more divisions to round that out. Let's template display everything else. And that looks pretty decent like this. And as before, we're going to just delete that UV attribute because we don't need it. And we can give this some normals as well. And you can see in this case, it's actually pretty important because whatever sort of, default implicit normals it was using before, they don't really look very nice. So adding explicit normals to this really helps out quite a lot. And as before, we'll add another path attribute. In this case, I'll call it creature body seams. We'll group that, merge it back in with everything else. And all of these layers of detail are starting to, build up to create a pretty nice detail-rich creature here. And then as one extra last little thing, I'm just going to add a tube in the center of this mouth region here. I thought it would be really cool to, use this interesting light inside the creature to illuminate it. And, as we get into the rendering side of things, you'll see that these geometry lights are a really nice way of making things look awesome pretty easily. And yeah, I'm just hand placing this tube in the center there just to get some cool inner illumination from that. And because the lights that we're building from this later will depend on the group called eye, I'm just giving this inner thing the eye group as well. And once again, the path attribute, keeping it all nice and organized. And I think that's enough for this video. Actually, one more little thing before finishing up this video here. Let's do a final check on our geometry after everything's been merged together. And we can see that we don't have any unnecessary attributes or groups. Everything's been cleaned up nicely, but there are 71 unconnected points here. Now, these unconnected points are generally just like free floating points that aren't actually connected to primitives, and these are generally unwanted byproducts of some of these modeling operations. So those should typically be cleaned up, and we can middle mouse on each of these to see where those unconnected points are coming from. And we can see that the unconnected points are happening here when we cut out those ridges. And it's not a big problem. We can just do a simple clean SOP to get rid of those. And the default options on the clean will get rid of unused points. So no options need changing, and that's all sorted. And now we can move on to doing the procedural modeling on the tentacles, and then get some animation happening and animate these along the path deformers. And then finally start rendering this.